your liver quiver. This man will make your bladder splatter. This man will freeze your knees. If you will, let's all welcome the world's godfather of soul, soul brother number one, James Brown. James Brown. James Brown.
Good evening. Welcome to a special edition of the Queen's Grapevine. This is your host, Wallingford Lee. Tonight on the Queen's Grapevine, a moment of soul. Tonight on the Grapevine, we want to talk a little bit about the godfather of soul, James Brown, who has such a great impact on soul music and funk overall, known as the Godfather, known as Mr. Dynamite. But more importantly, we're going to center our program on a 3-day festival that took place in Zaire in 1974. This festival took place as Mohammad Ali met George Foreman, a rumber in the jungle. Well, more important, we're not going to concentrate on the boxing part of it, more on the music, because it was such a soulful situation, having James Brown headlining the show, having Fania all-star players there, such as Johnny Pacheco, Celia Cruz, and the Latin Beat, and more important, Bill Withers with his great music. We also had B.B. King carrying on the Spinners, and the great Miriam Makeba, the famous lady that made Pata Pata, and various African musicians aboard. We might not have the opportunity to cover everything, but we want to give you, the viewing audience, a flavor. And what better person to talk about this but my special guest? I'm talking about Brother Hank Williams, who happens to be a professor of English right here in Lehman College. It gives us a great deal of pleasure to work with him. We have worked with him in the past, and you, my viewing audience, have called us on many occasions and wrote to us saying the great work that he has done and why he's not on. Well, he's back again with us, and tonight we're going to cover all these issues that I just mentioned to you. Mr. Williams, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be back.
Well, like I said, the program that we did on Black Radio and several other programs, we got quite a few letters about your outstanding performance and your answers to these programs. And we thought, why not talk to you a little bit about music, because we know you have a musical background and knowledge of it. What was James Brown meant to soul music or American music in general, in your estimation?
James Brown's contribution is just stratospheric in terms of, the music and even just the groundwork he lays for, for hip hop. You take a look at a lot of hip hop, and they're really taking samples from James Brown's, from Brown's work. And Brown's notable for several things. Number one, the performative aspect he brings to it, because it's not just the musical element, which is certainly important for sure, but Brown is, simply just a master of performance, a master of stage presentation, and simply just knowing how to get details and just about everything dialed in. So, that's a lot of what he brings to the table. And also he has an incredibly long and distinguished career too, which is rare in terms of popular music and pop stars, certainly today, but definitely even at his time. Brown's performing and successful from the 1950s, pretty much almost till his death in the 2000s. So that's just an amazing run for almost anybody.
Well, amazingly thing, James Brown popped up on the scene in 1956 with Please, Please, Please. And it's important to know, everybody talk about Michael Jackson, but the audition tape that Michael Jackson did with Motown, he was imitating James Brown, and that was his hero coming up. So James Brown has put a stamp on American music in more ways than one, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the festival in Zaire. We know for a fact that James Brown headlined that great festival. What was the purpose of that festival? We know that, again, it was a great match that was supposed to take place between George Foreman and Muhammad Ali. A lot of things took place because that fight was suspended for 6 weeks because Foreman had like a small cut, and it took him a while to recover, and it kind of put the festival in danger and stuff like that. We also read that James Brown had over $35,000 pounds of equipment that had to go.
Right.
And he said, "I'm not going without it." Tell us a little bit about the Zaire Festival.
The Zaire Festival is one of those incredible convergences of, really just of style, politics, and culture that is, I'd be hard pressed to think of a very good contemporary example of it, and it's not the only one. You have one a few years earlier in Ghana, which has also been captured on film. I believe the film's called Soul to Soul. A lot of your viewing base might be familiar with the Watts Tax film,
yes,
which captured a similar festival in Los Angeles,
yes,
and that was as a direct result to the rebellions there. And Zaire originally was pretty much just conceived of as a complement to the fight between Foreman and Ali that you pointed out, and ended up morphing into a much bigger thing on its own when the fight itself got postponed. But the idea was, and this was very much in keeping of the time, to have this gathering and this convergence of African American and continental African performers.
Well, let's put it one more time. If we go back to the 70s, we're talking about early 70s, 1974. At that time, James Brown was more than his peak. And more importantly, I think is one of the biggest festivals where actually, if you take the opportunity to look back at it on time or on DVD or on CD, you're talking about bridging these gaps, as Brother Hank just mentioned. We're talking about going to Africa to put together such a great festival. And the mixture, you had African singers and musicians. You have Latino singers, such as people from famous Fania All-Star, and the headline was by James Brown. How difficult was it to put together something so creative like that, you think?
Oh, logistically, it was extremely difficult, and they go through a good bit of that in the film Soul Power, which is a documentary of it, and I wrote an article about that. But the logistics alone were incredibly hard. Simply just one, being able to gather all those musicians. Two, then you have the logistical problems of actually getting them over to Zaire. And three, you have all sorts of technical and logistical details to deal with, simply just in terms of preparation of the space. And you also have to remember, and one of the strange contradictory things about it is this is about a third of the way through the reign of Mobutu Sese Seko, who
a dictator,
right? Dictator who took over after Patrice Lumumba, was assassinated. So it's so there's that sort of backdrop also that that I haven't gotten into too much, but that's also important to remember. So this is an extremely important propaganda thing in terms of what they're trying to do, and some of the musicians realize that, and they don't necessarily discount it, but I think they also see the opportunity for something possibly a little bit greater to come out of it, or at the very least a possibility for this type of exchange.
Well, were any of the singers concerned the fact that Mobutu happened to be a dictator? Were any one of them semi-concerned whether should I go or should I go and stuff like that? Because at the time, it's an African nation, and there are brothers and sisters. Were some concern here or there a little bit?
Bill Withers certainly was, and decided to go anyway. To be honest, I haven't taken a look at that aspect of it in terms of a lot of the other people. But one thing you have to realize is that political understanding works on several different levels. That's number one. And two is the backdrop of the Black Power movement. So Brown, for instance, to say the least, I seriously doubt that was a big concern for him, because, you know, and this isn't to put him down, but he simply just did not have that level of political engagement or political consciousness. And I think, you know, several of the other people, probably B.B. King, were about in a similar type of situation.
Let's talk a little bit of the performance that were there. We talked a little bit, it's important to know that Hugh Masekela, who was African,
Yes.
was there. We talk a little bit about Bill Withers. We talk about B.B. King. We talk about the Spinners, the famous group from Detroit, Michigan. We talked about also final star Celia Cruz was there, who happened to be the queen of Latin music. We lost her a couple of years ago, but she was there. And it's our understanding that Bill Withers mentioned that he was shocked and happy at the same time that she had a tremendous reception by the French-speaking Africa. Can you share a little bit of that with us about the various performances that was there, stuff like that?
I think you've done a good job of setting it up already. You really have this wide range of people from really across the spectrum in the United States. You know, B.B. King, as you mentioned, who's you know, just a phenomenal star in the blues world, and actually still has a very, very rigorous performance schedule. To somebody like James Brown, you know, certainly one of the premier stars of you know, soul at that point. Bill Withers, you know, extremely popular. The Spinners,
Wow.
you know, the Spinners, who, you know, represent you know, a very popular Motown group type sound, you know, mixed with a lot of African musicians, you know, Masekela and Miriam Makeba. But you even have people like the Pointer Sisters, you know, again coming out of U.S. R&B / soul type thing. But
Sister Sledge?
Yeah, Sister Sledge, but you know, all these are extremely popular groups, mixed with some people who not everybody would necessarily know
At that time.
But a lot of it is rather relative, because you're also talking about something happening on the African continent, where some of the people are extremely big there. You know, for instance, Brown, and that's part of the reason that he's included. And there are some other folks who probably, you know, weren't quite as well known. One of the wrinkles is the audience was originally envisioned to be quite a bit different. Because it was seen as an adjunct to the fight itself, the organizers assumed that quite a few international people, and certainly a large contingent of people from the U.S., were going to be going over there. All of that changes when the fight itself gets postponed. So you actually have a much different, but I think historically much more interesting mix of people than you would have originally had for this type of thing.
Originally, because of the suspension.
Exactly.
Yeah. We'll be right back in the Queen's Grapevine as we continue talking about the great festival that took place in Africa and Zaire back in 1974, headlined by the great James Brown, and of course Celia Cruz was there with our Tumbao and with Johnny Pacheco, which happens to be one of the great producers of Latin music. We'll be right back on the Queen's Grapevine as we continue going back in memory lane, talking about this fantastic festival that took place.
Right now, we'd like to do some of the tunes that created a sound called the James Brown sound. And this is the way it goes. One day a fella walked up and said, "Fred, James, play some of your old tunes." I said, "Hey man, we don't have no old tunes." I said, "Well, play some of your oldest but goodest." I said, "I don't dig that. Don't bury me while I yet live." Then he said, "Well, play the best of James Brown." Fred smiled and I frowned. He said, "Why are you frowning?" I said, "Because I can't do that. The best of James Brown is yet to come." I don't care, baby.
And we're back here in the Queen's Grapevine talking about soul power a little bit, and a moment in soul, where all the various soul singers and American singers that went to Zaire for this fantastic festival, headlined by the godfather of soul himself. And we're sharing this with you, our beautiful audience, especially some of you youngsters that might have not have been aware of. There was a great fight that took place in 1974. Great Mohammad Ali has always give his fights him a name. This one was something about the jungle, and a rumble in the jungle, and he met with Foreman, and of course Howard Cosell and everyone thought that Foreman, being so big, strong, and young, was going to knock him out. And guess what? Muhammad Ali came up with a famous rope-a-dope, knocked out Foreman, and became the champ. But we're not here for that. We're talking about music today. We have had the opportunity to work before, as I said to you, beginning the program with Hank Williams, who has been so great for our program, and to you, our viewing audience, sharing his thought process and various black cultures, issues them that we've touched, black radio. We talk about the migration from the South of our brothers and sisters coming up north and why they did. And Mr. Williams was kind enough to be on our program and share his point of view with our audience. And now we're talking about music. Hank, we know for a fact that you wrote an article about the soul power and the festival. Can you share it a little bit with our audience? What inspired you to write the article and your point of view in the article?
Well, I'd remembered a little bit about the festival itself from the earlier film When We Were Kings, which was a documentary primarily centered on the fight, but there was a little bit of background of the festival in it. And to make a very long story short, the director of that, Leon Gast, traveled over there and collected this enormous amount of video. Wow. And it was really there was way too much to deal with in When We Were Kings, which was primarily focused on the Ali fight. And so several years later, Jeffrey Levy Hint went back and went through a lot of the video that did not make the cut for the original film, but easily found enough to create the film that became Soul Power. And when I saw that, I was immediately hooked by several things. I mean, number one, just the power of the musical performances. Number two, the amount of stars you have there, and the fact that you see them. It really is a very rare moment in history because you're seeing all of them, Ali included, really in their prime. And so it was that combination of things, and this is one of the things I deal with in the article. I think there's the element of, what does Black Power and the Black Power movement actually mean? That comes up over and over again, and that's what. So those were just a few of the things that motivated me to do it, and it's primarily a review of the film. But one of the things that I focus on is that question of, okay, well, what does Black Power mean, and what does it mean if we're going to talk about, a more general Pan-African type view in terms of actually getting, physically reconnecting people from across the diaspora. So that's what I look at in the film in terms of that nexus of Black Power and what it actually means to different people, which is really nicely portrayed there because you have Ali. Ali at, on one, I don't necessarily want to say on one side of the fence, but you have Ali at one extreme who, as you know, was a member of the Nation of Islam, mentored by Malcolm X. So, he has a much more progressive, forward-thinking view of things. And on the flip side, you have people like James Brown and Don King, who are essentially, they're essentially brought into it from the standpoint of Black capitalism and the idea that they realize they can make money. And I don't want to say that's exactly where it ends with them, because part of the thing with Brown and a whole lot of other people who are on the periphery of movements is they're greatly affected by what's going on around them. And, I think that's important to remember, particularly now, now when you talk about artists. So Brown is very much affected by the discussions that's going on. Brown's affected by seeing the Black Panther Party. Brown is affected by seeing, Stokely Carmichael and the other movements that are, that are on the ground. So you really see the convergence of that, and not only the breadth of the movement, but people, actively working out the differences between it, on the screen there, which was one of the things that just fascinated me. And the second piece of it, which I alluded to before, is I think it's a very rare moment in time, because most of these artists go through some sort of lull. Brown is a certified superstar, but his career goes down in the early 1970s, and he's actually having a lot of problems getting bookings, particularly here in the U.S. And in the mid-1970s, he begins to have a little bit of a resurgence. Mm-hmm. You see similar types of things with B.B. King. Blues, the blues has an
intro period. Too.
Yeah, the blues has an extreme fall off, as does jazz in the mid-1960s, as people flock to newer forms of popular music. But in the late, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, there's actually a good bit of resurgence around, new audience groups, primarily on the college circuit and for the blues people, as part of ironically enough, the rock invasion. Many people look back directly on them. As a matter of fact, to this day, you'll still see in interviews by Mick Jagger and people like that giving praise to
black music.
Yeah, exactly, and these blues musicians. So it was a combination of all those things that I just found fascinating about this, and I think there's certainly a good bit more that could be written. There's certainly a lot more of the music that I really hope from the festival that I really hope actually comes out and gets re-released.
I hope so too, but you touched on a very important thing that I hope our youngsters are paying attention. You talk about Black Power and the importance of Black Power, and the article that you wrote, which I think was very powerful and very good. You talked about a very creative period of time where racism have always existed in this country, but in the 70s was a tough period. We're coming out of the 60s into the 70s. Mm-hmm. You talked about lack of booking for James Brown, and then a resurgence coming back by him. So all these type of things are important, and you youngsters watching a program like this, I beseech you, or I challenge you to look at these things and for you to get a flavor to know where we are today compared to those days. And those people that set the footprints. He talked about a tough Muhammad Ali, which this government stripped him of his title because of his religious belief. Okay, and he refused to go to the army, and he took no nonsense, and he fought them, and he came back. So 2 to 3 years of Muhammad Ali life as a boxer was taken away from him. So many things happened in the 70s that you youngsters are not cognizant or not aware of. And this article that Hank Williams wrote touching a lot of important things in that is a big education to your mind, and you go back in time to understand these things. When we talk about music, how would you consider the music of the 70s with what we're hearing today, in your estimation?
Well, that's a broad question. To try and give you a little bit of a substantive answer, one of the things that I think we need to think about is all musical forms go through various periods, particularly when you're talking about things that are part of popular culture, meaning meant for, very wide distribution and consumption, as opposed to things that are meant to be a little bit more conservatory oriented. So short answer is I think you have a lot of parallels between now and then. One of the things that I think people are always thinking about is the idea of musicians and social consciousness, particularly when you're talking about black music. The point you raise, I think, is important. You know, people do need to know that popular musicians at that point put a lot on the line. You know, in terms of their careers, in terms of popular reprisals. You know, we celebrate people like Nina Simone and Max Roach right now, but you have to realize they could not work. You know, for a good bit of a decade for both of them. Simone had to leave the United States. You have people like, you know, going back even a little earlier, you have people like Paul Robeson, who single-handedly politically trains a couple generations of musicians. So it's important to remember that, you know, there's a lot of work that was being done on the ground and by people fairly high up in the musical industry that I don't think is being done today. You know, you certainly have very politically conscious musicians today. I don't think you have as many who were at that high a level. You know, if Robeson gave you a call, you couldn't just not take Robeson's call. So that's one piece of it. The second piece of it is I would also, at the same time, I would also be a little bit wary about putting down categorically this generation of musicians, because I said before, one of the things you have to realize is the wider context is important. So the context at that time is discussions about, okay, you know, how do we move the movement forward? You know, how do we essentially pick up what Malcolm and Martin put down? You know, how do we relate to what the Black Panther Party is saying? You know, is that the right way for the black community to go, or should it be in a more nationalist-oriented direction, as you know, as the US organization and other people are advocating, or you know, should there be some sort of synthesis between the two? But the point is, you know, these are all conversations that are happening around, and musicians are taking this in and responding to it, and some of them are very actively engaged in the movement themselves. And I think that's the piece that's probably, at least in terms of that, that's the piece that's probably not around now, or at least not around as much as maybe it needs to be.
Interesting. Well, and those strong words, I want to thank you on behalf of the family of the Grapevine. Obviously,
Thank
half
you.
an hour is not a great amount of time to discuss these sensitive and important issues. I hope and pray that a second part of that video will come through, that they produce it, because that festival in Zaire was something else. And I don't have words to thank you for being our special guest. And we hope we'll have the opportunity to work with you again in the future.
Thanks again. My pleasure to be here.
And again, this is Wallingford Lee saying good night for the Queen's Grapevine, and saying to you that music have meant a lot to America, and especially the black community. So most of the time we hear the music. If we listen to the lyrics, we'll learn a lot. He talked about a lot of conscious music. My thing to you is, as I sign off tonight, go back and listen to the Marvin Gaye album, What's Going On, that was made in 1973, where Marvin Gaye talked about the war and all the social issues affecting America and affecting the black man. And again, this is Wallingford Lee saying good night for the Queen's Grapevine. Thank you for watching our program. We'll see you next week at the same place at the same time.